Part 1. The First Encounter. The bruise on her cheek should have been just another unnoticed detail, a mark on a woman who cleaned his penthouse every week, someone who was invisible in his world. But when Clara Drake flinched at the sound of his footsteps, something inside Deokwu snapped. He had built an empire on power, control, and ruthlessness, but that was different. He had silenced men for far less than the fear he saw in her eyes. "Who did this to you?" His voice was calm, too calm, like the quiet before a storm, a tone he reserved for threats, for danger. Clara's fingers trembled as she tried to cover the swelling bruise with a sliver of foundation, but it was no use. "I fell," she said, the lie tasting bitter, but it was the only defense she had left. Clara Drake had never been anyone's priority. She'd spent her entire life making herself invisible, learning the quiet art of moving through spaces without leaving a trace. It was a skill honed over years of surviving a world that seemed to forget she existed until now. The penthouse, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, was as silent as a tomb when Clara arrived. She adjusted the strap of her worn cleaning caddy, taking in the pristine marble floors and the sleek, minimalistic decor. The air smelled faintly of expensive cologne, sharp and citrusy. A scent she had come to associate with Deokwu, the man whose empire she had unwittingly become a part of. Clara was just a cleaner. That was all she had ever been to him, just another figure in the background of his immaculate life. For 6 months, she had worked in his penthouse without ever truly seeing him. Oh, she knew the important things. The way he preferred his coffee strong and black, the subtle power his presence commanded, the scent of his cologne that lingered long after he left. But in all that time, he had never once looked at her, not with interest. To him, she was invisible, and that was how she liked it. Until today. Clara's heart quickened as she moved through the living room, carefully dusting the shelves, trying to ignore the way the silence seemed to stretch around her like a cage. She had always been good at blending into the background, but today something felt different. Today, Deok wasn't just an absent presence in her life. Today, he was close enough to touch. The chime of the elevator echoed down the hallway, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't supposed to be back yet. He had a meeting scheduled, something that would keep him away for hours. But the elevator door opened with an unmistakable hiss, and there he was. Standing in the doorway, his sharp eyes locking onto hers with a sudden intensity that made her stomach tighten. "You're still here." His voice was smooth, casual even, but there was an underlying tension in his words, like he had expected her to be gone by now. His eyes, dark and calculating, scanned her quickly, pausing only for a moment on the bruises that marred her otherwise flawless skin. "I'm almost done, Mr. Devereux," Clara stammered, lowering her gaze, just as she had been taught to do her entire life. It was safer that way, safer not to look directly at him, not to acknowledge the way her heart seemed to race just by being in the same room as him. But he wasn't having it. "Look at me." His words were quiet but firm, and Clara froze. She had never heard him speak to her like that. It wasn't a demand, not really, but there was a weight behind the request that made her pulse quicken. Slowly, hesitantly, Clara raised her eyes to meet his. And for the first time in 6 months, something shifted in Deok's gaze. There was no longer the cool indifference that had always marked his expression. Instead, there was something deeper. Something raw. "What happened to your face?" he asked, his voice softer now, but no less intense. Clara's heart skipped a beat, her hand instinctively lifting to touch the bruise on her cheek. It had been there for days, the dark purple and blue marks fading slightly, but still very much visible. She had tried to cover it with foundation, but it was still there, a constant reminder of the man who had hurt her. "I just fell," she lied, the words tasting bitter as they left her mouth. She wasn't proud of the lie, but it was the only defense she had left. Deok didn't believe her. She could see it in the way his eyes narrowed, the way his jaw tightened. "You fell," he repeated, his voice a mix of disbelief and something else, something darker. Clara nodded quickly, desperate to end the conversation before it went any further. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her like a physical thing, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stand under the pressure. "Clara," he said, his voice suddenly softer, but no less commanding. "Who did this to you?" The question was simple, yet it felt like a tidal wave crashing over her. For a moment, she felt as though the world had tilted on its axis, and everything she had worked so hard to hide was on the verge of being exposed. But then something inside her snapped into place. She couldn't do this. Not here, not now. Not with him. "I'm fine, Mr. Devereux," she said quickly, her voice steady even though her insides were anything but. "It's nothing." Diak didn't move. Didn't blink. He was watching her, studying her, like she was an open book he was trying to decipher. "You're lying," he said, his voice low but firm. There was no room for negotiation in his tone. Clara took a step back, but he didn't let her retreat. In 3 strides, he was across the room, standing before her with an intensity that made her knees weak. He wasn't angry. At least, not yet. But there was something in the way he looked at her, a kind of quiet fury that made her heart race even faster. His eyes flicked to the wrist she had tried to hide beneath the sleeve of her shirt. The marks there were fresh, the faint outline of fingerprints still visible against her skin. She had tried to cover it, but it was no use. Diak had already seen. "Let me guess," he said, his voice colder now. "You fell too." Clara yanked her sleeve down quickly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. "Mr. Devereux, I really should finish up. I have a lot to do today," she said, trying to step around him, but he didn't move. He was blocking her path now, his presence filling the space in a way that made her feel small and exposed. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Clara hesitated, then reluctantly perched on the edge of the sofa, the cool leather pressing against her legs. She felt wrong in this space, out of place in her second-hand clothes and cheap shoes. Diak didn't sit. Instead, he stood over her, his hands casually slipping into the pockets of his designer trousers. He looked down at her with an expression that was both curious and calculating. "I notice everything in my space," he said quietly. "Every little thing. The way you arrange the books. The flowers you leave on the counter. Even the way you breathe when you think no one's watching." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "You're not just my housekeeper, Clara," he continued, his voice lower now, more intimate. "You're the only real thing in this apartment." Clara didn't know what to say. For a moment, she felt the world shift beneath her feet, and for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, Diakwu had started to see her. Clara had always been a woman who understood the art of invisibility. Growing up, it was a survival mechanism, moving through crowded spaces without ever drawing attention, making herself as small as possible. Invisibility wasn't just a defense, it was a shield, something that kept her safe from a world that didn't seem to care about her. And in her world, being seen, really seen, meant exposure. It meant pain. She had learned that lesson early. But today, something shifted. Diakwu wasn't like the others. She had known that from the moment she started working in his penthouse. The sharp, cold manner that commanded every inch of the space. The way he seemed to own everything around him, as though nothing, no one, could ever touch him. It had made her feel small, even smaller than she already felt in the world. He had been nothing more than a distant figure in her mind, a man who paid her well, gave her instructions, and never expected more than silence in return. But now here he was, standing before her, close enough that she could smell the faint trace of his cologne, like fresh bergamot, and something deeper, more dangerous. Diak didn't look at her like everyone else did, like she was just another part of the background. No, Diak saw her, and that was something Clara wasn't prepared for. Her breath came in shallow bursts as he watched her closely. "You're lying," he repeated, his voice still calm, but with an edge that made her insides tighten. Clara's heart raced, and her fingers clenched around the edge of the couch she was sitting on. She hadn't expected him to press. She hadn't expected him to care. And yet, here he was, standing just inches away from her, his gaze intense and unwavering, as though he could unravel everything with a single question. She wanted to disappear, to fade into the walls like she had done 1,000 times before, but something about Deok made it impossible to hide. "I don't need your pity," she said quickly, her voice betraying her, cracking under the weight of his stare. The words were harsh, but they were the only defense she could muster. She had to push him away, push him out of her world before he tore everything apart. But Deok didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I'm not offering you pity, Clara," he said softly, the words unexpectedly gentle. "I'm offering you protection. I'm offering you a chance to not be invisible." Her eyes widened, and she quickly looked away, unable to hold his gaze any longer. "I don't need anyone's protection," she murmured, though even to herself, her words sounded hollow. Deok's hand lifted, then stopped midair, hovering just inches from her cheek where the bruise marred her otherwise flawless skin. His fingers twitched slightly as though battling with himself. He didn't touch her, he didn't need to. The unspoken tension between them was enough to make Clara's pulse race. It was like he could reach inside her, touch something buried deep beneath the surface, something she hadn't let anyone see in years. "Tell me his name," Deok said, his voice now hardening. It was an order. Her breath hitched as the walls she had so carefully built around herself began to crumble. She didn't want to do this. She didn't want to tell him, didn't want to admit the truth. She had buried it all so deep, had convinced herself that if she could just keep her head down, keep moving forward, it would all go away. But Deok's eyes, those sharp, unrelenting eyes, kept pulling her back to the surface. "I can't," she said, the words barely a whisper. Deok's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the steady beat of Clara's racing heart. It was like the world had stopped, and all that existed in that moment was the weight of his gaze, the crushing pressure of his presence. "Can't or won't." Deok pressed, his voice quieter now, but still carrying that deadly certainty that made her blood run cold. She turned away, but it didn't matter. Deok wasn't going anywhere. He was determined to crack her open, piece by piece, until everything was laid bare between them. He wasn't just after the truth of her injury, he wanted everything. "I can't," she repeated, her voice barely above a breath. "Please, Mr. Devereaux, I just want to finish my work." "You're not leaving until you tell me," he said firmly, his voice taking on an almost predatory edge, as though every moment she delayed was driving him closer to the edge. "You're not leaving until you let me help you." "I don't need your help," she snapped, the anger rising inside her, mixing with the fear. It was easier to be angry than to face what he was offering. It was easier to fight than to admit that maybe, just maybe, she needed someone to see her, to stand up for her. Deok didn't flinch. Instead, he took another step forward, his towering figure making her feel small and exposed. "You're scared," he said quietly. "Scared of what it means to let someone in. But I'm not going to let you hide, not this time." Clara stood suddenly, the motion so sharp that it startled both of them. She grabbed her cleaning caddy and shoved it into her arms, desperate to leave. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm fine, and I don't need anything from you." But as she turned toward the door, Deok's voice stopped her once more. "If you leave now, you're leaving my protection behind," he said. His words were cold, calculated, and final. It was like he had just offered her a lifeline, but she had already chosen to let it slip through her fingers. Clara froze. "Protection?" She whispered the word, disbelief coloring her voice. "You don't even know me." Deok's gaze softened for a moment, but it was a softness that scared her more than his anger. "I know you've been hurt. I know you've been running for too long, hiding behind the walls you've built. But I'm not going to let you keep running. Not anymore." Clara didn't know how to respond. She wanted to scream at him, tell him that he was just another man who would leave when things got too complicated. But instead, she found herself standing still, rooted to the spot as Deok's words sank deep into her chest. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt the weight of someone else's gaze on her, not as a judge, not as a threat, but as something deeper, something that asked her to stay. "You have a daughter, Clara," Deok said, his voice low and firm. And I won't let anyone hurt her either. The mention of Zara sent a jolt of panic through Clara's chest. She turned sharply to face him. "What did you say?" she demanded, her heart racing. Deok's expression hardened, his jaw tight with resolve. "I've been watching you. I know your life isn't easy. I know the risks you take to keep your daughter safe. But whoever did this to you, whoever hurt you, will not hurt you again." Clara stood there, feeling the weight of his words, feeling the terrifying pull of what was happening. She had never asked for anyone's help before, and she didn't want it now. But for the first time in her life, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. Maybe, in this one moment, it wasn't about hiding anymore. Maybe it was time to be seen. Clara stood frozen for a moment, her hand still gripping the cleaning caddy like a lifeline, as Deok's words sank deeper into her chest. She had always lived her life in a state of constant motion, always running, always hiding. But now, with Deok standing just feet away, offering her something she had never allowed herself to accept, protection, she didn't know how to respond. He could see her. Really see her. And that terrified her. "You don't need to do this," Clara said, her voice low but strained. She was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince him. She hadn't asked for anyone's help. It wasn't her way. Her life had always been about survival, about doing everything on her own. She had never let anyone in, not like this. Not in the way Deok was asking. Deok's gaze never wavered. He stood there, unwavering, eyes intense. He wasn't giving her an inch, and something inside Clara broke, a small part of her, the part she had buried under years of calluses, of self-imposed invisibility. "I'm not asking for anything from you," she said, the words almost a plea. She wanted to escape the suffocating pull of his presence, but she couldn't move. It was like his gaze had frozen her in place, keeping her from running away from the one thing she feared most, being seen. Deok's voice was calm, but there was an underlying power in it that Clara couldn't ignore. "You don't have to ask. You've already had enough taken from you, Clara. It's time you let someone protect you." The words hit her like a wave, the weight of them crashing over her, threatening to pull her under. She had lived her whole life in a place of constant vigilance, always protecting herself, always looking out for the next blow. She had never allowed herself to need anyone, especially not a man like Deok. She wasn't foolish enough to think that someone like him, someone with his power and influence, could be anything but dangerous. But as she looked at him, something shifted. Deok wasn't like the others. His presence was commanding, yes, but there was something else behind it. There was something raw, something real. He wasn't just seeing the maid standing before him, he was seeing her, Clara Drake, and that terrified her more than anything. "I don't know what you want from me," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I'm not someone you can fix. I don't need your protection." Deok took a step forward, his presence surrounding her like a storm. "That's where you're wrong," he said, his voice softer this time, but no less firm. "I'm not trying to fix you, Clara. You don't need fixing. You just need to know that you're not alone anymore." For a brief moment, the words hung between them, suspended in the air, and Clara felt something inside her shift, a crack, barely perceptible, but enough for her to feel the weight of it. She had spent so long hiding, so long in the shadows, that the idea of being seen, really seen, was terrifying. But here, with Deok, she felt like maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe she could allow herself to believe that someone could care. But then the reality of her situation crashed back into her, and she shook her head, stepping back, trying to put distance between them. "You don't understand," she said quickly. "You don't know what it's like to live in fear every day, to have to watch your back constantly, to keep your daughter safe from a world that doesn't care." Her voice broke slightly, the emotion that she had so carefully kept locked inside spilling over the edge. "I don't have time for this. I don't have time for—" But Deok interrupted her, stepping into her space, his hand reaching out and gently cupping her chin, lifting her gaze to meet his. His touch was soft, tender even, but it held a strength that made Clara freeze. "Look at me," Deok said quietly, his voice a low command. "You don't have to do this alone. Not anymore." Clara's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been this close to him before, had never felt the weight of his presence in such an intimate way. He wasn't just a figure in her life anymore. He was here, right in front of her, seeing her, touching her, and the sensation was dizzying. "I don't want your protection," she repeated, though the words sounded hollow this time, as if she didn't believe them herself. "I'm fine on my own." Deok's thumb brushed across her cheek, just below the bruise, the tender touch sending a shiver through her. "No one is fine on their own, Clara. Not forever." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "And you're not going to convince me otherwise." Her chest tightened as his words sank in, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt her guard begin to crack. She didn't want to let him in. She didn't want to need anyone. She had worked so hard to build her life around independence, around being invisible, that the idea of allowing someone else to shoulder the burden felt like weakness. But Deok wasn't asking for weakness. He was offering something else, something foreign to her, something that both terrified and tempted her. "Care. I don't trust easily," Clara said, her voice barely AW. Whisper, almost as if she were saying it to herself. "And I don't trust people who live in your world. Your world is dangerous." Deok's expression softened, and for a moment, Clara saw a flicker of something deep within him, something raw, something real. "My world is dangerous," he agreed, his voice low. "But not for you. Not anymore." Clara shook her head, trying to push away the emotion that was threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't want to be part of your world," she said, the words sharp, as if saying them would somehow make them true. "I don't want any part of the things you do." Deok's hand, still holding her chin, gently tilted her face up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark, intense, and when he spoke, his voice was firm. "You don't have to be part of it, Clara. You just have to let me protect you. You can stay in your world. But let me keep you safe from the one you're running from." The finality in his words hit her like a punch to the gut. Deok wasn't giving up. He wasn't going to back off. His determination was as sharp as a blade, and it cut through her defenses, making her wonder, just for a second, if maybe, he could be trusted. But then the reality of who Deok was, who she was, crashed back into her. They were from different worlds, different lives. She didn't belong in his. She couldn't. And yet, as she stood there, feeling his thumb gently brush her cheek again, something inside her told her that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be invisible anymore. Clara stood at the threshold of something she hadn't been prepared for, something she had spent her entire life avoiding. Deok Devereaux had broken through the walls she'd so carefully built around herself, and now, standing in his penthouse, feeling the weight of his gaze on her like never before, she realized she was at a crossroads. Her world was about to shift in a way she couldn't control, and despite her instinct to run, she wasn't sure she could anymore. The truth was, she had never believed anyone would see her. She had been trained to blend into the background, to disappear. But Deok didn't look away, didn't treat her like an invisible figure in his life. Instead, he made her feel important, as if her presence, her being mattered. It was disorienting. She was used to being in control, used to making the rules. But Deok was rewriting them, and she didn't know how to stop him. "I don't need your protection," she said again, more for herself than for him. The words came out strained, as though she was trying to convince herself rather than him. She had said it to herself 1,000 times before, and she needed to believe it now more than ever. She couldn't afford to need anyone. Deok didn't flinch. He never did. Instead, he regarded her quietly, his expression calm but determined. There was something about the way he stood there, unyielding, that unsettled her. He wasn't a man who backed down. He wasn't a man who let people go. And that scared her. "I'm not asking you to need me, Clara," Deok said softly, but his words were weighted. "I'm offering you the one thing I never let anyone take from me, control. I'm offering you the chance to let someone else help you. Let someone else fight for you for once." His words hit her like a slap, leaving her breathless. She wasn't sure if it was the offer of help that shocked her or the idea that Deok believed she needed help in the first place. All these years, she had lived with the belief that she was alone, always alone. And now, this powerful man was telling her that she didn't have to be. Clara swallowed hard, trying to fight the sudden wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She wanted to shout at him, to tell him to leave her alone. She wanted to remind him that her life was complicated, that his world was dangerous, that she couldn't afford to get involved in any of it. But the truth was, a part of her had already crossed the line. She had already let him in, whether she wanted to or not. "I can't," she said, her voice shaking, but not from fear. It was from something deeper, something she couldn't name. She was terrified, yes, but it was a different kind of fear than she had known before. "I can't let you protect me, Diok. I'm not someone who can be saved." His expression softened, and for a fleeting moment, Clara saw something in his eyes, something that surprised her. It wasn't pity. It wasn't judgment. It was understanding, a deep understanding that made her throat tighten. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met," Diok said, his voice so quiet now that it was almost a whisper. "But even the strongest people need someone to lean on sometimes." Clara shook her head, unable to stop herself from pulling away from him, as if distancing herself could push away the truth of what he was offering. It was too much. He was too much. His gaze, his words, his presence, it was all too much. She couldn't let herself be that vulnerable. Not again. Not after everything she'd been through. "I can't afford to need anyone, Diok," she said, her voice low and tinged with regret. "I have Zara. I have to take care of her. I can't let her down. I can't let anyone in." Diok took a step forward, and Clara immediately took a step back. The space between them felt too small, too intimate. His eyes darkened, and Clara felt the shift in the air around them. It wasn't just the weight of his gaze, it was the sheer force of his presence. "Zara is the reason I'm offering you this," Diok said, his voice firm, yet filled with something else, something that sounded like caring. "She deserves better than this life of fear. And you do too." The words hit Clara harder than she expected, stirring something deep within her that she had long buried. She had spent so long protecting Zara, keeping her hidden from the world's ugliness, but now, she was confronted with the reality that her daughter wasn't the only one who needed protection. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Did she really deserve better? Did she deserve the safety Diok promised, the chance to stop living in fear? "You're not alone in this, Clara," Diok continued, his tone quieter now, almost tender. "I'm not offering you a perfect life, but I'm offering you a chance to live without looking over your shoulder every day. To have someone other than fear." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, the words pulling at her, breaking down the walls she had so carefully constructed. She wanted to run, wanted to tell him that she couldn't do this, that she wasn't the kind of woman who needed protection, that she didn't belong in his world. But in the deepest part of her, she knew it was a lie. She couldn't keep running. Not anymore. The silence between them stretched, and Clara found herself searching his eyes, searching for something, anything, that would tell her this was a mistake. But there was nothing but resolve there. Nothing but a steady promise that, despite the differences between them, despite the danger that followed him like a shadow, Diok Devereaux wasn't going to let her go. "I'm not a damsel in distress," Clara said, her voice still shaky but firm. "I'm not someone who needs saving." "I never said you were," Diok replied, his voice quiet but absolute. "But you do need protection. And I'm offering it to you." Clara's chest tightened as she fought the overwhelming urge to give in. To accept his offer. To let someone, him, be the person to take care of her, to take care of Zara. The idea was terrifying, but there was something inside her that longed for it. Longed to not have to fight anymore, to let someone else shoulder the weight for once. "You don't understand," she whispered, feeling the tears sting her eyes. "I can't let this life swallow me whole. I've spent so long trying to keep it together, trying to make sure Zara's okay. I can't fall apart now." Diok's expression softened, and he took a step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. The touch wasn't rough or possessive. It was warm, comforting, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara didn't pull away. "You're not falling apart, Clara," Diak said softly. "You're just letting yourself breathe." And in that moment, Clara realized that maybe, just maybe, she had been holding her breath her entire life. Holding on so tightly to the belief that she had to be strong, that she had to do everything alone. But Diak was offering her a chance to let go. And for the first time in years, Clara was tempted to say yes. Clara had never been one to second-guess her decisions. She was the kind of woman who had lived her life with quiet determination, never allowing herself to falter, to question the path she had chosen. She had built walls around herself, around her daughter, high enough to keep the world out, and she had fortified them with years of pain and self-reliance. But now, standing at the precipice of a choice she never thought she'd have to make, Clara found herself frozen in place, unsure of which way to turn. Diak's words had lingered in her mind long after they had left his lips. "You're not alone in this, Clara. Not anymore." The promise of protection was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it was everything she had ever wanted, an escape from the fear and danger that had plagued her for so long. On the other hand, it was the one thing she had spent her entire life running from. Needing someone, trusting someone with her safety, with Zara's safety, was that too much to ask? Her heart pounded as the reality of it all set in. Diak Devereaux wasn't just a man who lived in a different world. He was an enigma, a force of nature that seemed to exist on the edge of chaos and control. She had spent the past several weeks watching him, carefully observing the quiet way he moved through his life, commanding everything around him with a mere glance, a word, a gesture. But behind all of that power, there was something else, something softer, something human. It was terrifying. Clara paced in the hallway of her small apartment, Zara's innocent laughter drifting from the other room as she played with her dolls. Her daughter had been her anchor, the one thing that kept her grounded, that reminded her every day why she fought so hard to keep her life intact. Zara was everything to her, more than everything. And that was why Clara couldn't afford to make a mistake. She could already feel the pull of Diak's world, the danger, the wealth, the power, but more than that, she could feel the pull of him. The way he looked at her, the way he had made her feel seen for the first time in years. She had spent so much of her life hiding, thinking that if she just kept to the shadows, she would be safe. But Diak was asking her to step into the light, to live. She was on the edge of something she wasn't sure she could fully understand yet. And for the first time in her life, Clara didn't know what the right choice was. Zara's voice called to her from the living room, and Clara's heart ached. "Mama, who's that man who's always with you?" Clara stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't expected the question. Zara had always been perceptive, but this was different. This wasn't a simple curiosity, it was a deeper understanding, the kind that only children seemed to possess. Clara swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "He's just a man, sweetie. Someone who's helping us." Zara's young face peered around the corner, her eyes wide with innocence. "Why does he look at you like that?" she asked, her voice small. "Like you're special?" Clara's chest tightened as she turned away, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had promised herself she would never let Zara see her weak. She would never let her daughter feel the weight of her own struggles. But now, with Diak's gaze lingering in her mind, Clara realized how much of her life had been built on secrets, on lies, on a promise she had made to herself that she would never need anyone, that she would never allow anyone into her world. But now, Diak was different. He wasn't like the others. His words echoed in her mind. "You're the only real thing in this apartment." Real. She had never allowed herself to be real with anyone. Not with her past, not with the painful memories of Marcus, the abusive ex who had left her broken. Not with the scars she carried, both physical and emotional. But Diak had seen her. He had seen her in a way no one ever had, and despite everything inside her telling her to run, she found herself standing still, unable to move, unable to ignore the connection between them. She had always known that her past would catch up to her. that it would always be lurking, waiting to rear its ugly head. But Deok was offering her something she had never had choice. The chance to make her own decisions. To not live in fear anymore. To let someone protect her, just as she had protected Zara. For the first time, Clara realized that she didn't have to do this alone. She didn't have to carry the burden of the past on her shoulders by herself. And maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone else shoulder the weight. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, and then slowly exhaled. There was a decision to make, and it wasn't just about her, it was about Zara too. The life Clara had created for her daughter, the safety she had worked so hard to provide, wasn't just about keeping things together. It was about giving Zara a better life, a life where she didn't have to be invisible, a life where she could live. And if that meant stepping into Deok's world, if that meant letting herself be seen, then maybe it was time. When Clara opened her eyes, she knew what she had to do. She walked into the living room where Zara was playing, her small hands carefully arranging her dolls in a neat line. Clara sat down beside her, taking a deep breath as she looked at her daughter. Zara, Clara began softly, her voice steady but full of emotion. I think it's time for us to make some changes. Some big changes. Zara looked up at her, her innocent face full of trust. What do you mean, Mama? Clara smiled, her heart swelling with love for this little girl who had been her world. It's time for us to start living, baby. For real. Zara's eyes sparkled, a bright smile lighting up her face. Does that mean we'll get to see Mr. Deok more? Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had never said Deok's name out loud in front of Zara before, but hearing it now felt right. Yes, she said softly, it means we'll be seeing him a lot more. Zara beamed, clearly excited by the prospect. Clara watched her daughter for a moment, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt like she was making the right choice. Later that night, when Deok arrived at her apartment, Clara stood at the door and looked him in the eyes, the weight of their shared moment lingering between them. Clara, Deok said softly, his voice holding a touch of uncertainty, are you sure? She nodded, her resolve firm. I'm sure, Deok. We'll figure this out together. And in that moment, with the promise of something new hanging in the air between them, Clara felt the world shift. The weight of her past was still there, still lingering in the background, but she wasn't running from it anymore. She wasn't running from him either. Deok stepped forward, his hand reaching for hers. And as their fingers intertwined, Clara realized that for the first time in a long time, she was exactly where she needed to be. Not invisible. Not alone. But seen. And with that, she took the first step into a new life. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.